You're listening to Adapt and Thrive, the podcast that explores the tremendous pace of change, especially as it relates to the global multinational enterprise and the attached supply chain. Now, we've spent a lot of time recently focusing on the big elephant in the room, or black swan, or gray rhino, what have you, and that is COVID-19. And there are so many ways to think about the effects on supply chain here, and one that we haven't really talked about too much is demand. Now, I know personally as a consumer, I know my shopping patterns have changed tremendously in the past 6 or 8 weeks. I don't go to the mall anymore, certainly, or browse the stores the same way that I used to. And even when I do go out shopping, I find that some of the things I've come to depend on just simply are much harder to find, or not there. Things like toilet paper, eggs, paper towels, just very basic and essential things that you seem to take for granted most of the time. So to talk about the challenging shift in demand that we experience in times of pandemic, I've got Vikram Srinivasan back on the show. Vic, welcome back.
Hey, man, thank you so much. Really glad to be here and learn a little more and also share some of the understanding we've had on the demand space here.
Yeah, and so this is a bit of one of your main focuses, is the demand space, and so that's why I'm interested in talking to you about what's happening here. From going into the data, from what you've seen, how has demand shifted in this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a difficult time, right? Just across the board. It's not one industry. It's not a specific issue. It's a pandemic, right? And when a pandemic comes in, the thing that I've realized when we look at outside in forecasting, we've talked about this a few times. For me, the biggest thing that if you abstract it away is consumer sentiment, right? It's hit across every aspect, whether you look at economic regulations, economic changes that are coming in, you're looking at issues around, social distancing and the lockdown. All of that is driving a lot of behaviors on the consumer side, which in turn directly impacts demand. And it's not felt in one or two places, it's felt across the board. So, very interesting in the sense of how companies have to understand this, and how do you then take all of this data to be able to make sense out of it as you make decisions, both in the short term but also in the long term. So a lot of interesting things that I've seen that are happening. If, for example, you look at increase in spending, right? There's a lot of areas where there's a lot of spend increasing in terms of online grocery. Suddenly is becoming the way people are trying to shop, right? Because you're not going and risking yourself walking into a store, although you could, but people are preferring to have online grocery, curbside pickups. Food delivery is huge. The gaming industry is getting some increased spend here because of the fact that people are in work from home mode or lockdown for the most part. Supermarkets are generally fine, but home improvement projects are coming up. So those are just areas, if you think at a very high level, that impact consumer buying patterns and those industries in terms of how much more demand is being anticipated. But on the other side of the same coin, there is the less spending that's happening in apparel, airlines, fast food, movie theaters, obviously, and a whole bunch of other areas that and we could name just because of the fact that the consumers are either not spending the precious money they're trying to ensure they have in this very uncertain economic condition, or they are just not able to go and engage in these activities as well.
Yeah, and that has a crazy impact upstream. Some of these things are kind of planned like clockwork. It's almost you can set it and forget it for a lot of the items that you come to buy. There's a seasonality involved with apparel or footwear. There's just the traditional shopping trends that supermarkets forecast for food items. When it comes to commodities like paper products, it's a very consistent thing. Unless there's a new promotion or a product introduction, your demand probably doesn't change a whole lot, is what I would guess. So you do, even from the planning and execution side in the supply chain, I would imagine, start to take some of these things for granted. But that all seems like it gets thrown out of the window in times like these. Emotions change. The transportation and logistics network changes. The stores that are open, the nodes of the supply chain where you can sell things, are completely different. So what's your position on these changes, or how it can be forecast? It seems like it's really hard to predict, but is there ever a right forecast? And what are the things that that businesses need to do to try and keep up?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because it's such an important aspect to this whole time frame, right? It's not just the consumer sentiments, the outside in, looking at demand and signals. It's also, to your earlier point, supply disruptions, issues that are happening on the supply side, and it's kind of the combination of those two that needs to be considered. That makes the problem even harder. So, in an event like this, it becomes more and more important that we're not focusing on that. What's my forecast number and how I'm trying to drive towards it? But how can I dynamically adapt as market conditions are changing, as the COVID variables that we're looking at, causal variables that can tell us more about lockdowns, the social restriction levels going from high to low, things like that. How do we bring that on an ongoing basis into our decision making framework? And how do we also marry that to the supply constraints, supply capacities, and then have a much better understanding holistically as things change? And look at the rate of change and look at metrics around what's causing, which areas are changing more, and focus on those areas. And the rest of it, you can apply your existing processes for the most part and just prioritize the areas you should be looking at more heavily, because that way you can have a better pulse on what's changing and which product categories are changing. I'll give you a simple example, right? We're working with a CPG customer right now, and they have a whole bunch of products, right? But very quickly, we were able to tell them there's about 5,000 fundamental SKUs across about 15 to 20 different product families that you need to be focusing on, because the rate of change between the baseline and where it's at is huge. And the toilet paper example and so on, they're probably aware of it, but within that as well, the product family substitution, right? What's happening when you don't have that favorite brand you want to go buy? Which other ones are being picked up? Because they usually are not picked up. How do you gain a pulse of that rate of change? And how do you gain a pulse of the fact that this is a panic buy situation too? So how do you account for that and offset it in the coming months as well? So there's all those dynamics that need to be captured, but all of that also depends on the overall consumer sentiment, the overall COVID situation. And so we have to have a high level pulse on the whole situation, but then bring it to context for the key SKUs and prioritize it as we think about the decisions we need to make. But at a high level, if we can figure out what segments are important, understand, but also have that ongoing nature, I think that'll give you a much better process versus trying to come up with what that forecast needs to be and try to do a lot of curve fitting and modeling just to come up with a historic based forecast.
Yeah, and a few words in there that speak to me: sentiment, context. I think that the idea of consumer loyalty somewhat gets thrown out the window in a time like this, because when other people are panicking or maybe stockpiling goods, you take what you can get and you don't get upset. But people do get upset. This is really disruptive to their lives, and it is on the supply chain side, on those people that are forecasting to do their best to ensure that those goods are still moving, that they're getting to those consumers, to their customers in a B2B situation, so things can get made, at least the things that are still being made. It seems to me that, you're not really worried too much about what people are feeling in this sense. Like, people are scared. People have uncertainty. People don't know if they're going to have a job. Let's from that perspective, it's kind of a given that human emotion is going to play into this. But is that something that you need to worry about, or where's the data, I guess, that you're trying to parse when it comes down to that personal sort of level of the buyer behavior?
Yeah, so in terms of how you can provide that context, right? So let's dive in a little more. In that example, I talked about working with that CPG customer, right? The demand history itself, really looking out 1, 2, 3 years, as we would say traditionally, is a moot point, right? Because the demand history is completely different in the last 2 months versus the last 2 years. So what we recommend first is, once you've understood and segmented, like I mentioned, at a high level, which areas should you focus on based on the percentage of change, then what we recommend is to figure out what those change points are. When did the demand actually have that shift? Because that point in time is very different depending on the industry you're in, depending on the product line you're looking at, and depending on the region you're in. I'll give you some examples, right? In Italy, when did toilet paper spike is very different from in US when toilet paper spiked. It's also very different from in Michigan, toilet paper spiked versus that. Because again, It's that wave of sentiment that's going to tell us where this is going to happen. So it's very difficult to go and figure out the consumer sentiment side. That's a hard variable and a hard problem to solve, especially with the amount of churn that's happening. But what's more important is to understand these change points. So you can infer that through these change point detections. And these change point detections are not a one-time thing, right? Yes, you want to understand when did the COVID effect happen on which SKUs at what time. So that's the first change point. And then you figure out the consecutive change points that you need to detect, because those can tell you the rate of change over time. Some products are consistently ramping up, right? Toilet paper, there's no slowdown, right? So the rate of change is constant, but it's high. In some cases, it ramps up and it'll drop because people probably realize, it's not needed, and they kind of calm down. And in other cases, it's fluctuating not because of a demand problem, but because of a supply problem, right? The demand is still very high, but the supply is not there, so it drops, and then it goes up and drops. It does this nice triangular kind of thing. So from that overall perspective, the change points is a starting point, and then from there, bringing in COVID-related trajectories of causals, like number of new cases, increase in number of new cases, increase in number of deaths. Those are available information that can provide more context as well. And those two together, along with that segmented approach of focused prioritization, can give you a very quick understanding of where that area of focus needs to be and how do you, on an ongoing basis, test and continue to update your forecast based on that. And that's how I would approach the problem.
So in this context, are businesses just doing constant short-term forecasts, or are they having to look beyond? I mean, it just seems like if you're talking about the rapid rate of change, you can't look too far ahead, but what's the value in understanding the bigger picture or trying to get a more comprehensive picture of the shifts in your demand over time?
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked so far, it's more around restoring and trying to get a good pulse, right? Once you have that, I think another important step now is to say, okay, we understand these things. We're able to get a good pulse on the short-term forecast. We're able to marry supply and demand better, and we're able to make better decisions. And as the COVID variables change, we are adapting to it. But I think to your question, there's also this other important part of it, which is saying, now that that's in control, now let's take a step back and understand what's going on from the change versus the baseline. So if you look at your demand of your specific product line, take for example toilet paper, that one is a very simple baseline, right? It's very consistent for those products. So the only discussion on that one is how do you consider panic buying and how do you adjust for it? Because there's already data that's showing the demand for some of these items have dropped, not toilet paper specifically, but in general, items that really spiked have dropped for even below their baseline. So that's a good example to say, okay, it's dropped because of that excessive buy. How do I accommodate and offset that over time? So that's beyond the short term. How do you adjust it so that as you go out of this COVID scenario, how do you ramp up back to your baseline, right? So going from the new normal to the existing normal is kind of the question, right? The new normal is the COVID normal. And then how do these products go back to the baseline that's been there? And that process, again, is the next step of the discussion. How do you take that forecasting process to adjust it from that back to where it needs to be? And in some cases, as you do that, it might never come back to where it was. It might just be in the new normal. So that's where this art of modeling and looking at external data can help you. And these change points I talked about. But that's a great question, Matt, is if we can't just go from, okay, COVID's done, so I'm just going to go back to my old process. Because you just think of, I always envision and visualize demand history as a time series, right? Think of all your products across your entire portfolio and visualize that time series. The last 2 years are going to be a certain pattern, and the last 3 months is going to be completely different. These forecasting models will not be able to pick that up, right? It's going to be complex. So we need to consider a much more thoughtful process where we can bring in these external data, we can bring in some of these change points, and then go between the new normal and the baseline and figure out how we adjust between them in a very effective way.
Yeah, no, and that's an interesting thought. As I'm listening to you talk about this, I think that the only given through the course of this pandemic is that the forecast is constantly changing. Our expectations on this back in, say, January, and at that time it was really, not an issue that was in the Western hemisphere the way that it is now. A lot of people didn't think about it. It was business as usual. But then that rapidly changed. And if you look at the numbers and the forecasts on a day to day basis, even just in the news, how much this will hit the population, to what extent, even the percentage of people that maybe have more heavily affected than others on this, or the age group, that is not a very consistent line. It's always a little bit different every day. So I would think it's something that mirrors itself in the world of forecasting. When you're looking at the demand of your own product portfolio, um, you just have to be ready to accept that that's going to change, and could change fast. Do you have to do a lot of forecasts? I mean, is there, to me, it seems like there's maybe more value in having more data right now than maybe you even need.
Right. And it's also, like you said, right, it's about that ongoing forecasting. And the other part of this is when you look at the data, right? The consumer sentiment and all these factors, COVID in general, there's going to be a latency between the effect of that, how consumers then react to it, and then how they adapt to it, right? So that latency also has to be accounted for. And that's part of another data point to look at, right? You're going to see supply chain decisions being made more on the e-commerce side, the e-commerce channel side. Brick and mortar is kind of taking a huge hit already, and now it's taken an even bigger hit. So how do you account for that now? Is that a shift, or is that shift a temporary shift? So then, based on the data you're learning from and mining, these are the areas you need to be looking at: is are there temporary trends, or are there shifts that have happened because of this event? And typically, as we all know, events like these can have some plasticity with it, right? And because, again, you cannot explain consumer sentiment and consumer buying behavior. In some cases, people might be like, what if this next shock comes back? And they change the way they think about making decisions on a day-to-day basis. Let me ask you this, Matt, right? Would you go and start figuring out, how you can get, the process on online buying and e-commerce and online groceries, curbside pickup, and do more of it? Because you want to get used to a certain type of process, as opposed to being going back to that and then having to shift all over again, right? As a simple decision, all the way down to all the other things you might do. So it's a very interesting part of it, and that's where we have to do what we have to do right now, right? But we have to think and take that step back and do the due diligence, use the machine learning and AI as we can to really understand the shifts versus temporary impact that will come back to the normal.
Yes, this has been very much on my mind recently. I think in a technology lens, in the world that we live in, you don't want to say that there is like a world of missed opportunities out there, but there are. In the retail space, it's exposing how maybe weak our BOPIS, our buy online pickup in store systems, our delivery systems for retail or food and beverage are. As in my state, they've tried to reopen some liquor stores to meet demand. The only way they're able to do that is through phone calls. And you can imagine what happens when you've got an entire state full of people suddenly flooding the phone lines for a limited number of stores that have been repurposed from being a retail location to a pick and pack location for curbside pickup. It seems like so much of this it might be kind of a wake-up call to rethink the technologies that you're using. I would imagine the same thing kind of goes for the space when it comes to forecasting and demand, that the status quo just isn't going to do it. Whether you are in a normal environment, whatever normal is, or whether this is something that continues, whether the world is fundamentally changed as a result of the pandemic, it seems that being complacent with the tools, the systems, and processes that you've got in place isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, and also, right, the other equation to think about is supply chain leaders and how they're thinking about their supply chains, right? So clearly, COVID is a stress test on your supply chain in terms of key bottleneck areas and where you should be more responsive and agile and efficient, right? So if you think about key ingredients that you need, right? And do you have the alternate sourcing for them? Do you have the alternate vendors? Does it end with just your tier one suppliers? How do you think about that overall bill of material that leads up to your packaged products, right? Because it's not just this one finished good that's stocking out. It could be stocking out because you couldn't make it in the first place, which can come from a really in-depth bill of material structure that has all these different suppliers that feed into it, right? So the way people are going to think about their supply chain is going to be fundamentally different, and they might start spending more time in how they would think about being more responsive, but also providing customers faster value, maybe with more e-commerce presence, more online presence, things like that. Maybe online grocery is going to become the next thing for them, right? They're going to spend more time on how you can make that more effective. So they're going to come up with supply chain strategies from push from that standpoint, and there's this pull from a consumer sentiment standpoint and overall COVID reaction, right? And all of that together is going to create this next new normal, in my opinion. So there's two forces that's going to act. One is inside out, which is going to be how do these supply chains adapt? And that will they will promote certain types of decisions, and they'll make sure other things are easier. So that'll help shape how buying patterns. But the other side of it is also the uncertainty and the options you want to have and how consumers react in this space. So those two together is going to be interesting in how it pans out in the midterm. But I think in the short term, if I were to just kind of summarize what I've seen that's worked across multiple different use cases on demand, I would say focus, segment, and prioritize very quickly the biggest changing areas. Look at product substitution, understand those elements, and then look at change points, right? That's a very important part. And once you've understood those change points, there are some good algorithms that can do that. And once you understand that, that helps you understand how you can leverage the right treated demand history versus just looking at your traditional demand history. And then also learning across different SKUs and being able to understand how you can cross-learn so that it's not just one SKU that you're learning from. It could be across the product hierarchy. And once you have all of that information, being able to bring in that external context of COVID indicators and looking at scenario planning. So it's not just an ideal scenario. There's a best case, worst case, and an ideal scenario that you can have at all times. And then have this analysis in a way that this data comes into this process and you can repeat it every day or every week. That, for me, is the most important thing in a time like this, because it's very uncertain. Each of these factors feeding in to what I just said is uncertain. So if we can do that more effectively, I think you'll have a much better way to do the short-term forecasting. And then in the midterm, we can talk about that in more detail.
And don't underestimate the power of these forces. Inside out, change management at your own organizational level is tough. You can build the supply chain that you envision that you want it to be, but it takes a lot of work to get there. But those outside in forces, that's where it seems to me you really need to start relying on some of these more advanced technologies, these analyses and pictures of factors that perhaps you never thought about before. To your point earlier, it's a vast sea of data and information out there that can help drive and help businesses better understand the market that they're serving. From a technology point, I guess, what are some tools or what are some things that people should look for as they're looking to enhance this picture of their forecast?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that there are a few AI-driven solutions or capabilities that can help inform some of those change points I talked about. But then I think going in understanding the value of AI, right? This is a perfect area where you have to go beyond your traditional methods, right? You can't be stuck with those statistical methods. You have to think about, AI and figuring out how that can put the context of COVID over your data, and not just learn from that one SKU, but learn across your entire learn across your SKUs. So AI does a phenomenal job there. There are a lot of deep learning models out there that can help there, and I would say continue to figure out how to invest in that, because that's going to be, from a technology side, that's going to be the new normal, right? You have to understand product substitution very quickly. You have to understand the level of hierarchy you need to forecast at very quickly. You need to understand how you can cross-learn across your SKUs very quickly. You need to understand change points very quickly and shifts. You need to bring in external data as part of the causal forecast. You need to be able to do this on an ongoing basis, so very quickly, and adapt that forecast every day. You need to be able to look at scenario planning. So there's about 7 to 8 different things that need to happen, right? And there are solutions out there. There's methods out there. So I would say continue to look and invest in those capabilities, because that's going to become the new normal. It's not about, let's look at the rearview mirror, let's understand historical trends and extrapolate. That is actually, in some cases, not too bad a solution, right? But in other cases, it's just not going to cut it in the COVID context, as we just talked about. So that would be my recommendation, is to start thinking through those.
No, that's great perspective, Vic. So as we close out this episode, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave with our audience today?
I think we've covered for folks in terms of how you should think about the overall process. But I would say if there are 3 things to take away from all of this, it is continue to make sure you have a process for the short-term forecasting that is more adaptive and dynamic, because that's what would help right now. And focus your energy on the top changing items, because that's whether it's up or down, it's going to help a lot. And then figure out how you can bring in more, not only external COVID data that you could help with this problem, but marry your supply and capacity and other data to this, so that in some cases you wouldn't be able to explain when the demand fluctuates, because it's nothing to do with the buying behavior, it's to do with the supply. So I see 3 fundamental segments across all the data sets we've seen: the data set that's growing continuously, the data sets that have declined, and the data set that oscillates. And the data set that oscillates is usually from a supply constraint perspective. The data that's growing, you would have to, or declining, you would have to understand the change points and things that I've talked about, and understand leading indicators that explain it, and then create that adaptive process across scenarios and plan for it. So I think that would give you some good starting points. And then AI would be the way, I would say, could actually help you solve this problem more effectively, beyond the rudimentary methods that have been out there on the statistical method side.
Thanks, Vic. Yeah, that's great insight. And I do tend to agree that in this sort of time, you can't just harden your defenses. You do have to think differently and think of ways that you can perhaps even invest in your own capabilities, the technologies that you use to better capture this data, to have a living baseline, and to get beyond just short-term forecasting, because normal is constantly changing, and you have to be prepared for it through any circumstance. And so when it comes to this piece of the supply chain, to me, so much of it really does all start with demand, and demand is a crazy and volatile thing, as we're seeing right now. That wraps up this episode of Adapt and Thrive. Thanks again to Vikram Srinivasan, Senior Director of Product Management at LLamasoft, for joining. To learn more about the podcast, visit llamasoft.com/podcast. If you found us on any of the major networks, whether it's iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your downloadable media, please be sure to hit the subscribe button if you liked what you heard. Leave a review, and send any feedback my way to matt.gunn@llamasoft.com.